Chapter 16. Prisoners in the Dungeon. Presently the blue phantom faded out and was gone. Darkness like a blanket pressed down on Pete. He tried once more to wriggle free and only got himself more tightly tangled in the big net. What a fix, he thought glumly. Instead of nabbing a harmless old fellow who was playing at being a ghost, they had been nabbed themselves. The two characters who had netted them looked tough enough, and they had obviously been ready and waiting. Pete thought of Bob and Worthington waiting for them down the canyon road. Would he ever see them again? Would he ever see his mum and dad? He was feeling as miserable as he had ever felt in his life when a light began bobbing across the room towards him. As it came closer, he saw that it was an electric lantern in the hand of a tall man. This one was wearing the long robes of an Oriental nobleman. The man reached Pete and bent over him, shining the lantern in his face. Pete could see cruel slant eyes and a mouthful of gold teeth. "Small fools," the man said. "Why could you not be sensible and stay away like the others? Now we must take care of you." He drew a finger across his throat and made an ugly noise. Pete got the message. His blood ran cold. "Who are you?" he asked. He stuttered a little, getting the words out. What are you up to?" "Ha!" the man said. "To the lower dungeon." He picked Pete up like a sack of potatoes, threw him over his shoulder, and started back the way he had come. Slung over the man's shoulder, Pete couldn't see much in the almost total darkness. He knew they went through a door, down a passage, then down a very long flight of winding stairs. They came out in a corridor that felt damp and chilly, went through some more doors, and wound up in a small room like a cell, a dungeon cell. There were rusty ring bolts attached to the walls. Something white, like a cocoon, was lying in a corner. The smaller Arab sat beside it, sharpening a long knife. "Where is Abdul?" the Oriental asked. He dumped Pete on the stone floor beside the cocoon, which turned out to be Jupiter, still wrapped in the net which had caught him. "He went to get Zelda," the small Arab said in a deep, guttural voice. "She and Gypsy Kate are hiding the pearls. We are going to take a vote on what we shall do with these puppies we have caught." "I say we just lock the door to this cosy little room and leave them," the second man said. "No one will ever find them, and soon the old castle will really be haunted." "It's not a bad idea," the Arab grunted. "But just to make certain, we ought to let a little blood first." He ran the edge of his knife along his thumb, and Pete, watching him, swallowed with difficulty. He wanted to whisper to his stocky partner, but Jupiter was lying so still beside him that Pete was afraid he might be hurt. "I'll go and see where Zelda is." The Arab sheathed his knife and stood up. He cast a glance at the two bundles on the floor. "Come along and give me a hand hiding our tracks. These fish won't get out of the nets very fast." "You're right. We must make haste." The tall Oriental hung his electric lantern on the wall so that it clearly illuminated the two boys. Then the two men hurried out. Pete could hear their footsteps growing fainter. Then he heard a grinding sound as of a large rock being moved. Then silence, until Jupiter spoke. "Pete," he asked, "are you all right?" "It depends on what you mean by all right," Pete told him. "If you mean no broken bones, yes, I'm fine. I'm dandy. I'm peachy pie." "I'm glad you have not been injured." Jupiter sounded very upset. "I must apologize for leading you into unsuspected danger. I was too sure of my own deductions." "Oh, it could happen to anybody," Pete answered. "I mean, it sounded so logical. Who could guess we were going to run into some kind of gang? Especially when we didn't find any traces outside of anybody using this place as a hangout." "Yes, and I was so sure Mr. Terrell must be the one who was responsible," Jupiter said, "that it never occurred to me to suspect otherwise. Tell me, can you move your hands?" "I can wiggle my little finger if that's any help," Pete said. "I'm all tangled up in these meshes." "Fortunately, I have the use of my right hand," Jupiter told him. "I am making some progress towards freeing myself. Maybe you can help by telling me where to cut next." Pete flopped over on his side. Jupe did likewise. Now that his partner's back was towards him, Pete could see that Jupiter had managed to get a Swiss knife that hung from his belt. Its 8 blades included a screwdriver and a pair of scissors. Jupiter had opened the tiny pair of scissors and had snipped several of the net's meshes so that he could get his hand out. "Cut over towards your left," Pete whispered. "You'll be able to get your left hand free. That's it." The scissors were small and the net seemed to be made of tough nylon, but with Pete directing, Jupiter made progress. Soon he had both hands free. After that, he was able to make much faster progress. He was starting to cut off the whole bottom half of the net when they suddenly heard footsteps. For a moment they were too terrified to move. Then Jupiter's wits began to work and he rolled quickly over onto his back to hide the cut net. They waited with pounding hearts. In a moment, a stooped old crone came into the room, holding an electric lantern high over her head. She wore tattered gypsy robes and had huge gold rings in her ears. "Well, my pretties," she cackled, "resting nice and comfortably. So you wouldn't take that warning that Gypsy Kate, good Gypsy Kate, went to so much trouble to leave you? And now look what's happened to you. Always heed a gypsy's warning, my pretties, and you'll be the better for it." Something about the stiffness with which they lay attracted her attention, for she hurried directly to their sides. "Tricks, my pretties, tricks," she cackled. Deftly she turned Jupiter over and saw the cut net. "So that's it. The chicks want to escape." She grasped Jupiter's wrist and twisted it. The knife fell to the floor. She scooped it up. "Now we must teach you a lesson, pretty ones," she said, and raised her voice. "Zelda!" she screamed. "Ropes! Ropes! Our birdies want to fly away!" "I'm coming, Kate, I'm coming," a voice answered in English accents. In a moment, a tall woman, well-dressed, appeared in the doorway. She held a length of rope in her hand. "They're clever, very clever," the gypsy crooned. "We must tie them tightly, tightly. You help hold this one while I truss him up." Pete could do nothing but watch as the two women made short work of securing his partner again. First they cut the net loose from Jupiter, then tied his hand securely behind his back. Next they tied his feet. Finally they ran a rope from his wrist to a rusty old iron ring set into the stone wall. Since the net that held Pete was intact, they just wound the rope around him a few times and tied it well. "Now they'll stay, Zelda," the old gypsy cackled. "They'll never leave. I've convinced the men we mustn't be cruel. Oh no, we mustn't be cruel. We mustn't spill blood. We'll just leave them and close the door to this dungeon cell. They'll never tell anyone what has happened." "It's a pity," the Englishwoman said. "They seem like nice boys." "Don't get soft now, Zelda," the gypsy screeched. "We voted, and you can't go against the vote. Hurry now, we must hide our tracks and be gone." She shook the light from the wall and scurried out. The Englishwoman held the other lantern and played its beam down on the two helpless boys. "Why did you have to be so stubborn, ducks?" she asked. "Everyone else got scared and stayed away. Our little tune from the terror organ, and no one else has ever returned. Why did you have to keep coming back?" "The 3 investigators never give up," Jupiter said stubbornly. "Sometimes it's more sensible to give up," the woman replied. "Well, it's time for me to say goodbye. I hope you won't be frightened in the dark. I have to go now." "Before you go," Jupiter said, and Pete had to admire the way he kept his voice steady, "may I ask a question?" "To be sure, boy, to be sure," the woman said. "What criminal enterprise are you and your confederates engaged in?" Jupiter asked. "La, such long words," the woman laughed. "Why, young man, we are smugglers. We smuggle valuables from the Orient, mostly pearls, and use this old place as our headquarters. For years we've kept everyone from coming near it by making it seem haunted. It's the perfect hiding place." "But why do you wear such noticeable costumes?" the boy asked. "Anyone who sees you is bound to notice you." "No one sees us, young man," the Englishwoman said, "and I mustn't answer all your questions or you won't have anything to think about. Goodbye now, in case we never meet again, and I don't think we will." She took the electric lantern and hurried out. As she slammed the cell door shut, darkness wrapped itself around the two. Pete felt his throat getting dry and his tongue sticking to the roof of his mouth. "Jupe," he said, "say something. I want to hear some noise." "Oh, I'm sorry," Jupiter sounded absent-minded. "I was thinking." "Thinking? At a time like this?" "Why, yes. Did you notice that when Gypsy Kate left us a few minutes ago she turned to the right and went down the corridor in that direction?" "No, I didn't notice. What difference does it make?" "Well, that's the opposite direction from which she came. So she's not going back upstairs into the castle. She's going deeper into the dungeon. That suggests there must be a secret entrance somewhere, which would also explain why there's no sign of anyone going in and out outside." Whiskers! Even tied up in a dungeon and left to starve, Jupiter couldn't keep his grey cells from buzzing. "I don't suppose while you've been doing all that thinking," Pete said, "you've thought of any way to get us out of here?" "No," Jupiter said, "I haven't. I can't think of a single solitary way for us to get out of here unassisted. Please accept my apologies, Pete. I made a bad miscalculation in this case." Pete couldn't think of anything to say to that, and in silence the two boys lay and listened to the tiny sounds in the darkness. Somewhere a mouse scampered, and somewhere else water was dripping. The slow drops as they fell seemed to be measuring off, one by one, the minutes that were left.